When a Japanese nurse defied her orders in Okinawa and saved the enemy, the biting wind of Okinawa in 1945 carried the scent of salt and the acrid tang of gunpowder, a constant reminder of the brutal conflict that had engulfed the island. For months, the relentless tide of war had washed over this land, leaving behind a landscape scarred by fire and despair. Amidst the chaos, where the very air seemed to vibrate with the echoes of fear and hatred, a fragile thread of humanity persisted, often in the most unexpected of places. This is the story of such a thread, a moment of profound defiance against the tide of dehumanization, a testament to the enduring power of compassion when it seemed all but extinguished. It is a story not of grand strategy or battlefield victories, but of a single quiet act that rippled outward, a whisper of empathy in the deafening roar of war. The island of Okinawa, a strategic linchpin in the Pacific theater, became a crucible of unimaginable suffering. The fierce resistance of Japanese forces, fighting with a desperate tenacity born of a culture that viewed surrender as ultimate dishonor, clashed with the overwhelming might of the Allied invasion. Every inch of ground was contested, paid for in blood and sacrifice by both sides. American soldiers, far from home, faced a foe they were conditioned to see as subhuman, an enemy whose very existence was a threat to their survival. Japanese civilians, caught between their own military's brutal defense and the advancing enemy, endured horrors that would forever be etched into their memories. In this maelstrom, the lines between combatant and civilian, between perpetrator and victim, blurred into a devastating grey. The propaganda machines on both sides worked tirelessly to paint the other as monstrous, devoid of any recognizable humanity, a necessary psychological tool to fuel the engines of war and justify the escalating atrocities. To see the enemy as anything other than a target was a dangerous deviation, a potential betrayal of one's own cause, a lapse that could cost lives, their own or those of their comrades. Yet, within this landscape of pervasive animosity, where the prevailing narrative was one of unyielding enmity, individual hearts sometimes found a different rhythm. This script delves into the quiet rebellion of one such heart, an act that transcended the boundaries of nation and uniform. It is the story of a Japanese nurse, bound by duty and the fierce imperative to protect her own, who made a choice that defied the very tenets of the war she was forced to participate in. Her story, and the stories of those who witnessed or were touched by her actions, offers a unique lens through which to examine the enduring capacity for kindness, even when it is most perilous. We will explore not just the historical context that forged these opposing sides, but the deeply personal landscape of fear, duty, and ultimately shared humanity that allowed a single gesture to bloom in the barren soil of war. This is not a tale of miraculous peace treaties or sudden ceasefires. It is a micro-narrative, a close-up examination of a single moment that, in its quiet power, speaks volumes about the human spirit's resilience. The specific angle we explore is the profound impact of unsolicited empathy from an unexpected source. In the brutal calculus of war, where every interaction is dictated by survival and the imperative to destroy the enemy, an act of compassion towards that very enemy is not merely surprising, it is a radical subversion of the established order. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the enemy is not an abstract concept, but individuals with their own fears, their own capacity for suffering, and their own potential for kindness. The story of this nurse in Okinawa is a powerful illustration of this truth. It asks us to consider what drives such an act, a flicker of recognition of shared vulnerability, a deeply ingrained moral compass that refuses to be silenced, or perhaps a profound understanding of suffering that transcends national boundaries. We will peel back the layers of historical conflict to reveal the human beings at its core, demonstrating that the seeds of compassion can sprout even in the most scorched earth. This journey will not shy away from the grim realities of war. The tension, the fear, the pervasive sense of loss, these elements are integral to understanding the magnitude of the act we will explore. The historical backdrop of the Battle of Okinawa provides a stark contrast to the intimate human moment at its center. It is a story that begins with the chilling reality of conflict, where the very air crackled with animosity, and moves towards a deeply personal revelation of shared humanity. We are not looking for easy answers or simplistic narratives of good versus evil. Instead, we are seeking the complex, often contradictory, nature of human behavior under extreme duress. The narrative will weave together the objective historical facts with the subjective emotional experience, creating a tapestry that is both informative and deeply moving. The question of why will hang in the air, not as a puzzle to be solved with definitive logic, but as an invitation to contemplate the enduring mystery of human connection. The initial moments of the Battle of Okinawa were a symphony of destruction. The relentless pounding of artillery, the deafening roar of aircraft, and the desperate cries of the wounded formed a chaotic overture to months of unimaginable suffering. For the American forces, landing on those shores represented the culmination of a long and arduous campaign, a step closer to the Japanese mainland, and a confrontation with an enemy renowned for its fanatical defense. For the Japanese, it meant the defense of their homeland, a sacred duty that demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The island itself, a lush tropical paradise, was rapidly transformed into a hellscape, its verdant hills pockmarked by trenches and caves, its beaches littered with the wreckage of war. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a constant hum of dread that permeated every waking moment. Soldiers on both sides lived under the shadow of constant threat, their senses heightened, their nerves frayed. The psychological warfare waged by both armies served to solidify the image of the enemy as a faceless, monstrous entity, an other, to be feared and destroyed without question. This pervasive atmosphere of animosity was not merely a backdrop. It was an active force, shaping perceptions, dictating actions, and making any deviation from the path of hatred a perilous undertaking. Within this crucible of fear and aggression, the stage was set for an act of profound human courage, a moment where the instinct for survival was momentarily eclipsed by something far more powerful. The grim reality of the battlefield was a constant, visceral presence. For the American soldiers, the island was a treacherous maze, each step fraught with peril. Snipers lurked in the dense foliage, hidden trenches offered deadly ambushes, and the unwavering resolve of the Japanese defenders meant that every gain was hard-won and paid for with precious lives. The psychological toll was immense. The constant exposure to violence, the loss of comrades, and the pervasive dehumanization of the enemy bred a hardened resolve and necessary armor to endure the horrors. The image of the Japanese soldier, often portrayed as a relentless, emotionless warrior, fueled the fear and loathing, making it difficult to see any flicker of shared humanity. The objective was clear: defeat the enemy, survive, and return home. In this environment, empathy was a luxury few could afford, and an act of kindness towards the enemy would be seen not as a sign of strength, but as a dangerous weakness, a potential betrayal. The very air seemed to vibrate with the collective will to destroy, a force that sought to extinguish any spark of compassion. Yet, beneath the surface of this brutal conflict, the human heart, even when encased in the armor of war, retained its capacity for profound feeling. The story we embark on centers on such a moment, a quiet act of defiance against the prevailing tide of animosity. It is a story that unfolds not on the grand chessboard of military strategy, but in the intimate, often hidden, spaces of individual conscience. The island of Okinawa, during those fateful months of 1945, was a microcosm of the wider war, a place where the extremes of human behavior were laid bare. It was here, amidst the cacophony of battle and the pervasive atmosphere of hatred, that a singular act of profound empathy would occur, an act that challenged the very definition of enemy and revealed the enduring presence of compassion, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. This narrative seeks to illuminate that moment, to explore its roots in the shared human experience, and to understand its lasting reverberations. The particular focus of this narrative is not on the grand sweep of history, but on the intimate, often overlooked, currents of human connection that can flow even between sworn enemies. We are drawn to the quiet rebellion of the individual conscience, the moment when a person, faced with the overwhelming pressure to conform to the brutal logic of war, chooses a different path. The story of the Japanese nurse in Okinawa offers a powerful illustration of this phenomenon. Her act of defiance was not born of a grand political statement or a sudden conversion to pacifism. It was, we will explore, a deeply personal response to a moment of shared vulnerability, a recognition of a fellow human being in profound distress, regardless of the uniform they wore. This narrative aims to delve into the emotional landscape of that moment, to understand the forces that compelled her to act against the prevailing norms of war, and to trace the subtle but significant impact of her choice. The island of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 was a world ablaze. The relentless roar of naval bombardment preceded the landing of American forces, turning verdant hills into scarred earth and peaceful villages into smoldering ruins. For the Japanese defenders, it was the final stand, a desperate fight to protect the homeland, imbued with a cultural imperative of absolute resistance. For the invading American soldiers, it was a brutal, bloody slog, a testament to the ferocity of their adversary and the grim determination to achieve victory. The very air thrummed with a volatile mix of fear, hatred, and a desperate will to survive. Propaganda on both sides had meticulously crafted images of the enemy as monstrous, subhuman, a force to be eradicated without mercy. To see the other as anything less than an existential threat was considered a dangerous lapse in judgment, a potential act of treason. In this charged atmosphere, where every interaction was steeped in suspicion and the ever-present threat of violence, the concept of empathy towards the enemy was not just improbable, it was a radical, almost unthinkable deviation. The prevailing narrative was one of absolute division, a stark dichotomy between us and them, with no room for common ground. The psychological landscape of war was as brutal as the physical one. American soldiers, far from home and facing a relentless, often unseen enemy, were conditioned to view the Japanese as an implacable, almost alien force. The constant threat of ambush, the gruesome realities of combat, and the pervasive dehumanization fostered a deep-seated animosity. To show mercy, to acknowledge the enemy's humanity, was not only discouraged, it was often perceived as a sign of weakness, a dangerous vulnerability that could cost lives. The objective was survival, and survival depended on a clear, unyielding distinction between friend and foe. The propaganda machines on both sides worked relentlessly to reinforce this division, painting the enemy in the darkest possible hues, stripping them of any recognizable human traits. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of fear and hatred, where each act of violence by one side was met with a mirrored, often escalated response from the other. The very fabric of society on both sides was geared towards the singular purpose of war, leaving little space for acts that defied this monolithic objective. Within this crucible of conflict, however, the human spirit often finds ways to assert its inherent capacity for connection, even when those connections are most dangerous. The story we are about to unfold is not one of grand political shifts or miraculous peace treaties. It is a story that focuses on a single profound act of quiet defiance, a moment where the prescribed narrative of enmity was momentarily suspended. It centers on a Japanese nurse in Okinawa, a woman caught in the maelstrom of war, tasked with caring for her own people, yet presented with an opportunity to extend compassion to the very enemy she was taught to despise. Her choice, made in a context where such an act could have severe repercussions, speaks volumes about the enduring power of empathy, a force that can bloom even in the most barren and hostile of environments. This narrative seeks to explore the intricate tapestry of emotions and circumstances that led to this singular act, and to understand its subtle yet profound reverberations. The unique angle of this story lies in its exploration of altruism, born not from shared identity, but from a shared experience of suffering, a recognition of fundamental human vulnerability that transcends the artificial boundaries of war. We are not examining an act of political reconciliation, but a deeply personal, almost instinctual response to another human being in need. The prevailing narrative of the time on both sides was one of absolute otherness, where the enemy was stripped of individuality and reduced to a monolithic threat. This nurse's action directly challenges that narrative. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the enemy is comprised of individuals, each with their own capacity for pain, fear, and even kindness. Her story, therefore, offers a powerful counterpoint to the dehumanizing rhetoric of war, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, the capacity for compassion can endure, and that sometimes the most profound acts of humanity are performed in the quietest of moments, with no expectation of reward or recognition. In the midst of the inferno that was Okinawa in 1945, where the very earth seemed to bleed, an unexpected act of grace bloomed. It was an act that defied the brutal logic of war, a quiet rebellion against the pervasive narrative of hatred that had consumed the island. This is the story of a Japanese nurse, a woman sworn to care for her own, who chose to extend a hand of compassion to the enemy, a gesture that would echo far beyond the battlefield. The island, a strategic linchpin in the Pacific, had become a charnel house, a place where the lines between combatant and civilian, between life and death, had blurred into a horrifying, indistinguishable grey. The relentless tide of war had washed over Okinawa, leaving behind a landscape of devastation and a population gripped by fear and despair. Both American soldiers, fighting a brutal campaign to secure a path to the Japanese mainland, and the Japanese defenders, committed to a fanatical resistance, were locked in a struggle that seemed devoid of any quarter. The propaganda from both sides had successfully painted the other as monstrous, subhuman, an entity to be feared and annihilated without hesitation. In such an environment, where survival depended on a clear, unyielding distinction between friend and foe, an act of empathy towards the enemy was not merely unusual, it was a dangerous, potentially fatal act of defiance. The pervasive atmosphere of animosity was a tangible force, shaping every interaction, every decision. American soldiers, weary and battle-hardened, were conditioned to see the Japanese as an implacable, almost alien, foe. The constant threat of ambush, the gruesome realities of combat, and the relentless dehumanization of the enemy fostered a deep-seated loathing, a necessary armor to endure the horrors. To show mercy, to acknowledge the enemy's humanity, was not only discouraged, it was often perceived as a sign of weakness, a dangerous vulnerability that could cost lives. The objective was survival, and survival depended on a clear, unyielding distinction between friend and foe. The psychological warfare waged by both armies worked to reinforce this division, painting the enemy in the darkest possible hues, stripping them of any recognizable human traits. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of fear and hatred, where each act of violence by one side was met with a mirrored, often escalated response from the other. The very fabric of society on both sides was geared towards the singular purpose of war, leaving little space for acts that defied this monolithic objective. Yet, within this crucible of conflict, the human spirit often finds ways to assert its inherent capacity for connection, even when those connections are most perilous. The story we are about to unfold is not one of grand political shifts or miraculous peace treaties. It is a story that focuses on a single, profound act of quiet defiance, a moment where the prescribed narrative of enmity was momentarily suspended. It centers on a Japanese nurse in Okinawa, a woman caught in the maelstrom of war, tasked with caring for her own people, yet presented with an opportunity to extend compassion to the very enemy she was taught to despise. Her choice, made in a context where such an act could have severe repercussions, speaks volumes about the enduring power of empathy, a force that can bloom even in the most barren and hostile of environments. This narrative seeks to explore the intricate tapestry of emotions and circumstances that led to this singular act, and to understand its subtle yet profound reverberations. The echoes of these moments, though faint, resonate through time, challenging the simplistic narratives of war and offering a profound counterpoint to the rhetoric of absolute division. They suggest that the true battleground is not merely the physical landscape, but the internal terrain of the human heart and mind. It is within this space that the forces of hatred and compassion engage in their perpetual struggle. The persistence of empathy, even in its most fragile forms, offers a powerful testament to the inherent potential for connection that lies within us all. These are not merely historical footnotes, they are living lessons, demonstrating that the capacity for understanding and kindness is not a casualty of war, but a fundamental aspect of our being that can, and often does, endure. Therefore, as we depart from the stark landscapes of Okinawa and the echoes of its past, we carry not a simple historical account, but an invitation. An invitation to look beyond the manufactured divisions, to recognize the shared humanity that binds us, even in the face of profound disagreement. The true practice begins now to cultivate that quiet resilience of the spirit, to nurture the seeds of empathy that we have seen bloom against all odds. For kindness does not end wars, but as these moments so powerfully attest, it is kindness that ultimately survives them. A testament to the enduring, unyielding heartbeat